first step is neural communication. And when we're talking about neuroscience, we're talking about what is sometimes referred to as biological psychology. And what biological psychology tries to do is to create the link, or at least describe the link between our nervous system and our behavior. And as you can see on the slide, there are a number of different ways of describing the work that these people do in a number of different job titles that each of them has. The basic unit of the brain is called the neuron. A neuron is a nerve cell, also known as a brain cell, and there are over 100 billion neurons in the brain. The neuron is composed of three main components: the cell body, the dendrite, and the axon. You see on the slide here, you have in addition the myelin sheath. The crucial thing to remember here is that incoming information, the neuron is an information machine. It has the processing capacity of a typical laptop computer. So the incoming information to the neuron typically enters through the dendrite, the tip of the dendrite, sometimes through the cell body, but primarily through the dendrite. Outgoing information, that is information packs which are released from the neuron, are released from the axon terminal tips. So you have an entry through the dendrite, an editing by the cell body, and an exit through the axon terminal points. The myelin sheath is a fatty sheath which encases the axon and helps speed up neural transmission. And in fact, when the myelin sheath becomes degraded, this is one of the indicators of multiple sclerosis. But that's a story for another day. And you can see on the diagram here what I just described. Take a few moments to study the diagram. The way neurons communicate with each other is through electricity and chemistry. A neuron is an electrical device. The brain is an electrical device. In fact, if you could grab a handful of neurons, you could light a flashlight with them. And the activity of neural communication begins with an action potential. Remember, potential in this sense doesn't mean possibility, but it refers to an electrical charge, just as possibly you've studied in your physics classes, or chemistry for that matter. So an action potential is a neural impulse, and it travels along the axon. That's the long tail of the neuron that you just saw in the previous diagram. And there are ions moving in and out of the axon, primarily sodium and potassium. So essentially, sodium enters the neuron and potassium leaves the neuron once the neuron becomes depolarized. And this is something that happens, the action potential happens on an all or nothing basis. So there's no part action potential. It either happens or it doesn't. And there has to be a certain threshold of stimulation reached before the action will occur. And you can see on this diagram a bit of a graphic of sodium ions entering the neuron, potassium ions exiting the neuron through the axon and becoming depolarized. There are information packets called neurotransmitters which are released from the neuron at an area called the synapse. And the synapse is the gateway between one neuron and another. So you'll have in the sending neuron, a neuron which is sending information to another neuron, you'll have information released from the axon terminal buttons. That information is a little packet called a neurotransmitter, and then absorbed, not really, but for our purposes here we'll say absorbed by the dendrite on the receiving neuron. In fact, what happens is that you have just a very brief touching of the the neurotransmitter to the receiving neuron, and that's how the information is sent. The neurotransmitter doesn't travel into the receiving neuron. It sends its message and then hangs around in the synaptic gap for more action to happen. And you can see that process indicated here on this diagram of neural communication. There are many neurotransmitters in our nervous system. At last count, there were about 30 or 35 identified. We'll be talking more about neurotransmitters, especially when we get into psychological disorders much later on in the course. But they are two main neurotransmitters which are indicated in mental illness, which we'll see later on, are serotonin and dopamine. Neurotransmitters all have multiple functions. So one function of serotonin is mood stabilization. And people who suffer from depression, for example, one indication of that depression is a deficiency of serotonin. They have low levels of serotonin. So antidepressant drugs are designed to try to boost levels of serotonin. We'll see a lot more about that later on in the course. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter which is involved, once again, as serotonin is, in multiple functions. However, it's in terms of mental illness, it's indicated in schizophrenia. And people who suffer from schizophrenia, if they suffer, for example, auditory hallucinations, too much dopamine is often found in the temporal lobes of those individuals, and therefore they suffer from those auditory hallucinations. So antipsychotic drugs, in part anyway, are meant to reduce levels of dopamine in those areas of the brain. And you can see a list of some of the main and most understood neurotransmitters on this chart. And this is also reproduced in your textbook, or something similar to it is anyway. Two more neurotransmitters. The oldest one discovered back in the 1940s, acetylcholine, is responsible in large part for muscle function, but also it's indicated in our ability to concentrate. People who suffer from attention deficits, for example, might take drugs which would work on the acetylcholine system to help them focus better. And this is also true of people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease. Endorphins are the body's internal painkillers, closely related to morphine and therefore closely related to heroin. And these are neurotransmitters which kick in when we are suffering from pain. People who are high endurance athletes, for example, long distance runners, often describe the runner's high, which results from extreme exertion over a long period of time. And what happens is they break through a wall of pain. The endorphin system kicks in and the pain is reduced, and therefore they're able to finish their runs. That's oversimplifying things, but that gives you a picture of how endorphins work. This diagram shows the different ways in which drugs entering our nervous system, which we'll talk more about later on, can either mimic a neurotransmitter, in other words, behave like a neurotransmitter and bind to a receptor site on the receiving neuron, or block the receptor site of a neuron. The bottom line is, and the essential thing here, is that the drugs mimic, in one case, a neurotransmitter and therefore send the brain a signal that the neurotransmitter normally would, or alternatively, it blocks the neurotransmitter and prevents the neuron from functioning. An example of this from the world of illicit drugs, well, not necessarily illicit drugs, but psychoactive recreational drugs, which we'll talk more about later on, is on the one hand, we have alcohol, which acts as an antagonist, and it slows down neural functioning in some neurotransmitter systems, whereas you have another neurotransmitter which would, for example, in the case of the cannabinoids, things which resemble marijuana, would bind on to a cannabinoid receptor and stimulate that neuron, and therefore you resulting in the higher pleasurable feelings that result from marijuana consumption. So neurons are built up into the nervous system. There are two basic breakdowns of the nervous system. There is the central nervous system, also known as the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and everything else is the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means on the side. So anything that isn't brain and spinal cord, all the nerves that extend through to your vital organs and your limbs and your eyes and other sensory receivers, are the peripheral nervous system. And you can see the breakdown here on this chart. It's a handy way of remembering these things. What's the difference between a neuron and a nerve? Nerves typically are bundles of neurons working together in the peripheral nervous system, and sensory neurons bundle together to carry incoming information from our sense receptors. Sensory neurons transmit information from the eyes, ears, tongue, our sense of touch, and so on. Interneurons, of which there are many, many more than neurons themselves, which the introduction or the fact that interneurons exist in the nervous system makes the nervous system a system of trillions of neurons. Are neurons that mediate, that send information between neurons. For example, an interneuron would work between a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. So if I received information that an item is too sharp and I shouldn't lay my hand on it, but I do anyway, and I receive that information, I of course pull my hand away if I'm smart. Well, an interneuron would send the information from the sensory neuron, which tells me that the item is sharp, to the motor neuron, which would then indicate that I should pull my hand away. The somatic nervous system are those neurons and nerve bundles which control our muscle groups, our skeletal muscles. The autonomic nervous system is a system over which we have no control. It controls digestion, perspiration, pupil dilation and contraction, and so on. There are two basic parts of the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic nervous system, which engages when we're under stress, the so-called fight or flight reaction, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us down once the moment of stress is over with. So, an example, the sympathetic nervous system in action would be if we're feeling under threat. Our ancient ancestors confronted a saber-toothed tiger and had to get away. Then our pupils would dilate. There'd be enormous transfer of blood to the major muscle systems. We would start perspiring probably quite heavily, and of course we would run away. Once the danger is over, we get calmed down. The parasympathetic nervous system would kick into action, so bodily functions such as digestion would begin again once the danger is over. Here you see a handy diagram of the nervous system and its breakdown into sympathetic and parasympathetic. A reflex does not require a brain. A reflex is an automatic inborn response to a sensory stimulus. So I put my hand on a hot item, immediately withdraw my hand. I don't have to make a decision because the, uh, the spinal cord only has to receive that heat information and will automatically, for me, withdraw my hand. I don't need my brain to make that decision. There's an obvious benefit to this insofar as if it took too long for us to receive that information and process it, we could get badly injured before our brains had a chance to respond. Neural networks are interconnected neural cells, and the neural network can involve a number of inputs from different senses, eyes, ears, nose, and so on, and a number of different outputs in terms of action and other kinds of behavior. Now the brain itself. If you put your two fists together, clench your fists and put them together at the fingers, that's about the size of your brain in your head. And the brain, as I said before, has about 100 billion neurons in it. And one of the main ways in which scientists understood the brain before modern technology was through people who suffered brain injuries, which are called lesions. A lesion in certain parts of the brain would result in usually a deficit or problem with behavior, with speaking or understanding speech, or with movement, and so on. And when those people passed away, scientists were able to anatomize their brains and to discover that in fact people had injuries in certain parts of the brain, which might have been from a blow on the head or from a stroke or from some other type of trauma, and they were able to determine that in fact the behavior resulted from, or the lack of behavior, the impaired behavior, resulted from a brain injury. These days we have more modern techniques. The EEG, electroencephalogram, can measure brain wave activity because, as we said before, the brain is an electrical device, so it emits different kinds of waves. And an EEG is often the first stop in trying to discover what might be going wrong with a person's brain. This is especially true if somebody's suffering from a sleep disorder. And if you ever go to a sleep disorder clinic, one of the things they will likely do for you is to test your brain waves by way of EEG, because the kinds of waves that are emitted by the waking brain are different from the waves emitted by the sleeping brain, which we'll see later on. Other techniques, which are enumerated in detail in your textbook: the CT scan, the PET scan, the MRI scan. CT gives a rough picture. PET gives a more detailed picture in action. The PET can actually watch the brain or in real time and give scientists an idea what's going on in there in real time, whereas the CT gives a still picture. The MRI gives an even more detailed picture than the CT scan does. And the fMRI will give a detailed picture in real time. Each of these is usually used in ascending order because the CT scan is relatively cheap and most hospitals will have them. However, as you move up the ladder, you come to the fMRI scan. Those are quite expensive and not necessarily every hospital will have them. So if they can identify what the problem is with the CT scan, they will, and they will use that. However, if they can't identify a problem and there's obviously still an issue with the way your brain is functioning, they'll bring in more sophisticated machinery to try to diagnose. See here this MRI scan. This is kind of interesting. This is a picture of a person who has schizophrenia, and one of the things we'll see later on is that there are little holes in the brain which carry cerebrospinal fluid. And you can see on the left the normal size third ventricle, which is what we're looking at there, and the ventricle of somebody who suffers from schizophrenia. And so one of the hypotheses about schizophrenia is that in fact there's less brain tissue in the schizophrenic brain, and that's one of the things that causes people problems. The oldest part of the brain is the brainstem. We share this part of the brain with all creatures, from our little frog and snake friends right up to ourselves. And this is divided into several different sections. The medulla is the base of the brainstem, and this controls heartbeat and breathing. As you can see in this diagram here. Then we move up a little. We have the reticular formation, and among other things, this plays a role in arousal, particularly when it comes to the sleep-wake cycle. And then at the top, there's the thalamus. And the thalamus, the top of the brainstem, is sort of like a switchboard, and incoming information from the sensory organs is then sent out to the relevant brain areas so that the organism can behave appropriately. The cerebellum is sometimes called the little brain, sitting at just beneath the back of your brain, what's called the occipital lobes. And this is responsible for, among other things, balance and fine motor movement. The limbic system is something which reptiles don't have, at least as far as we know, but we mammals do. The limbic system is a system of brain areas which are below the cerebral cortex, that is the top layer of the brain, but above the brain stem. And you could consider this an emotional processing center, especially the amygdala, which is the main emotional processing center of the brain, and it is primarily programmed to process the emotion of fear, which makes sense from a survival point of view, because if we didn't feel fear in the past, we probably wouldn't be here, or stress for that matter. There's a word for animals that don't experience stress, and it's called extinct. The hypothalamus is the part of the brain which is responsible for maintaining homeostasis, that is, levels of stable body temperature, levels of hydration, and so on. It's also sometimes referred to as controlling the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. Think about it. And you can see your limbic system laid out in this nice diagram here. Always handy to have a picture. Many experiments have been performed on animals to try to test the limbic system, and we'll look in class at some detail. Pardon me, in some detail at how this is done when it comes to rats and drug abuse. The cerebral cortex is the outer layer of the brain, and it's the one that's most recent in evolutionary time. And this is, you could call, the thinking brain. So you have the highest level of information processing here. The cerebral cortex is made up of a number of different cells: motor cells, sensory cells, interneurons, and so on, and also glial cells, which help to support, nourish, and protect neurons, among other things. There are 4 lobes, or areas, of the cerebral cortex. You have the frontal lobes, which is right behind your forehead, and the frontal lobes, particularly the prefrontal cortex, does the most sophisticated thinking of all the brain. Most especially with your prefrontal cortex, you can think about the consequences of your behavior. And not only can you memorize your French conjugations and perform your calculus on the spot and balance your chemical equations, but you can also think about the consequences of behavior. And people who are violent criminals, if you study the prison population, we'll talk about this more later on, often those people have a great deal of trouble with their prefrontal cortex. They have a great deal of trouble in regulating their behavior, and that indicates a problem with the prefrontal cortex. We'll talk more about that later on. Parietal lobes process sensory information, and help us orientate ourselves in space so that we, for example, even while we're asleep, our parietal lobes are active and therefore we don't fall out of bed. Our parietal lobes have an internal map of our environment so that we stay in bed even though we're fast asleep. The occipital lobes process primarily visual information. The temporal lobes, just behind your ear, process auditory information. The occipital lobes seems kind of backwards. The eyes are at the front of the head, and the occipital lobes are at the back of the head. Why would that be? We'll talk more about that later on. Motor cortex is a strip just behind the frontal lobe, or pardon me, as part of the frontal lobe rather, uh, behind the prefrontal cortex, and that controls voluntary movements. We make a decision to pick up our pens or to open our computers. The motor cortex is in action. The sensory cortex, the front of the parietal lobes, processes that information. So that would give us an idea of the texture of the pen or the feeling of our laptop computer as we open it up. And you can see a nice diagram here, the various parts of the body in the motor cortex and the sensory strip. An fMRI, as I said before, can actually track the brain in real time. It's an expensive piece of equipment, and not all hospitals or research institutions have them. But you can see here that in a real brain, you have in the red and yellow a part of the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, that has lit up as the subject looks at faces. Well, what does it mean to light up? Well, what it means is that the fMRI is able to record glucose consumption in those cells. So anytime we're using a part of the brain, we're using all our brain just about all the time, but once we put a particular part to a particular action, there is going to be a lot of glucose metabolism, a lot of energy used up in that part of the brain. And that's how these machines very cleverly are able to pick up that information. You have the auditory cortex just behind your ear, the temporal lobe, and as we said before, the visual cortex, strangely enough, at the back of the brain. More about that later on. The association areas of the brain are areas which help to integrate various kinds of information at once. So I'm being bombarded with sensory information and I have to make decisions about movement and so on. Those so-called association areas of the brain help us to integrate all the information so we take the appropriate action. So when it says it's uncommitted, it doesn't mean it doesn't do anything. In fact, it's very committed to helping us make the proper decisions to behave appropriately according to the information that we're getting from our environment. Two language areas of the brain, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, two among others. Broca's area helps us form words and speak. The Wernicke's area helps us make sense. So the Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, the Wernicke's area is sort of bordering the parietal and the temporal lobes. Damage to these areas results in language deficiency of some kind or another, also called aphasia. And you can see some of this in action in the diagram presented here. And here. One of the things that neuroscientists have found in the past generation is that the brain has tremendous ability to reorganize itself according to experience. Every time, this is referred to as plasticity. Now that's sort of a metaphorical use of the word. What it means is that the brain will adjust to the environment. So if I have to learn to be good at calculus in order to get into the program I want to be in university, for example, my brain will reorganize itself if I practice calculus again and again and again to help me develop that skill. In other words, the information I'm sending to the brain, if I'm doing something again and again, whether it's trying to do calculus or playing hockey or working on a musical instrument, whatever it might be, the brain is very good at deciding for itself, well, this must be important, and therefore I better organize my neurons and my neural pathways and all the organizational system of the brain in order to make this easier. But in addition to that, even in the cases of severe brain trauma, people have found that an area of the brain may be heavily damaged, but other areas of the brain over time can learn to take on the function of the damaged part of the brain. The brain, the cerebral cortex, is divided into two hemispheres, and those hemispheres talk to each other through a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. And sometimes in cases of extreme or epilepsy that won't respond to drugs, surgeons will have to cut the corpus callosum. Epilepsy results, as we'll discuss in class, epilepsy results from too much electrical activity in the brain, therefore crashing the brain the way a computer which is overloaded with information will crash. And therefore it becomes a very dangerous situation for the individual involved. So in some cases, these interconnecting fibers will be cut in cases of extreme epilepsy. Now here's the thing, and we're going to look at this in more detail in class. If the two sides of the brain can't communicate with each other anymore, can the person go on to lead a normal life? Yes, they can. But we've either discussed this already in class or we will soon, so you're just going to have to wait to find out how that happens. This is called split brain. And we'll look at this in more detail in class, but you might be able to figure it out right now on your own. Interesting stats about how left-handers die earlier than right-handers. Some people believe it's because they're trying to live in a right-hand world, and therefore, for example, dangerous power tools are designed for right-handers, and if you're a left-hander trying to adapt to those dangerous power tools, just as a simple example, then you're more likely to get seriously injured. Here's a nice summary of the brain structures and functions. And the endocrine system, which is our hormonal system. The neuron system works fast, like email or text message. The endocrine system works slowly, like Canada Post or a UPS delivery system. Very important system, but one works through electricity in the brain, and the other one works through slow carriage through the bloodstream. The master endocrine gland is the pituitary gland. And you can see described some of the main aspects of the hormonal system, the endocrine system, right here.